Hello and welcome everyone. I'm so excited to have you all joining us this afternoon for the webinar. Today we're going to be talking about two really exciting trends in the world of business intelligence: data storytelling and the shift toward cloud infrastructure. Today we're going to kick it off with some introductions for those of you who don't know me. My name is Joe Hillary. I'm a research analyst with Eckerson Group and the lead author of our recent report on data storytelling. Today I'm excited to be joined for this discussion by JP of Toucan Toco, who is an expert on some of these aspects of data storytelling. I think we're going to have a really great conversation. This will be a wonderful opportunity for everyone to learn more about the modern BI space and some of the exciting innovations that are happening there. For a little additional background, I'm going to let JP introduce himself and Toucan Toco.
Hi, Joe. Very nice to be here, and thank you for the intro. So yes, I am a product marketer at Toucan, and the goal of Toucan is essentially to bring answers faster to Fortune 500 businesses and to small SaaS vendors as well, who, despite the fact that they've already invested in BI, are still struggling because of the amount of friction that there is in analytics. And the way that we solve that is by having a modern approach to the way that we deliver reports, and that's data storytelling. And it's by being a company or by having a product that is adapted to the modern infrastructure, to teams who want to modernize the way that they essentially deliver analytics, hence data storytelling in the cloud. So data storytelling very much is a specialty of ours, and it's a subject that we've been immersed in for quite some time. So I'm very excited to be here and to talk about that subject.
Perfect. Thank you so much for joining us, JP. Most people are probably familiar with Eckerson Group at this point. For those who aren't, we're a research and consulting firm that specializes in data technology and data and analytics. You can see here some of our recent clients on the consulting side. We also regularly produce reports on a wide range of topics in the data space. Today, we're here to talk about BI. So what's the problem? We've had business intelligence for a while now. The real challenge is businesses continue to be plagued by low adoption rates. The goal is always to be data-driven. It's hard to be data-driven if you can't actually get the data into the hands of your users, business leaders, and decision makers. One of the reasons this has continued to be a problem is, as JP was referencing earlier, the friction in the space. Over the last 5 years or so, we've seen some growth. So adoption rates have gone from about 10% to about 30%, which is better. It's an improvement. It's still not great. In order to sort of infiltrate your business, have data driving decisions at every level, those rates really need to be higher. And so what we're seeing is the business intelligence space pivoting, trying to find new ways to integrate themselves into the business workflow, business environment. And some of the innovations that are coming out of that, we anticipate will help increase some of these adoption rates by reducing the friction to using data within organizations. So this new approach is sort of defined by two key areas. There's two trends we're really going to be diving on today. The first is data storytelling. Now, this is a new evolving approach to how we're actually presenting data. And so thinking about the ways in which we communicate our data insights and doing that more effectively to reduce the burden on the data consumer. The other piece is more technological, more infrastructural. And that's thinking about shifts in where our data resides and aligning our BI strategy with our broader data strategy, particularly as folks migrate to the cloud. And so thinking about cloud-native, cloud-first infrastructure. We're going to kick off this conversation by talking about data storytelling. I recently completed a report looking at trends in data storytelling, diving into data storytelling as an organizational competency. So I'm going to go through some of the research that came out of that report, and the full report will be available to you. So what is data storytelling? Well, data storytelling is essentially a translation layer. From an organizational standpoint, it connects the data workflow with the business workflow. Right now, companies spend millions of dollars every year on their data infrastructure, on highly technical data professionals who are skilled and able to deal with numbers effectively. And yet, very few of those insights are able to successfully make their way into a business decision. At the end of the day, the value of our data is driven by the value of the decisions that we can make based on it. Data storytelling helps bridge this gap. So on one side, we can think about that data workflow. We have our analysts, we have our data scientists, these technical, highly skilled personnel who work with data day in and day out. They take raw data, they identify critical KPIs for our organizations, they do in-depth analysis, they build models. They are able to identify what is relevant in the data. On the business side, we have business leaders who know the space, who know the domain, who understand the strategy, and they transform insights into decisions. The key piece that's missing is how we transform data insights into business insights. And data storytelling is really what helps us bridge the gap, turn those insights delivered by our data analysts, data scientists, into something that our business leaders can really ingest and act on. And this is a theme that's going to come up several times in this conversation, but a big part of this is how do we turn data into action? JP, did you want to chime in a little bit here as well as we sort of look at this broad view of data storytelling and how it fits within that organizational landscape?
Yeah, sure, Joe. So you defined it pretty well. I mean, data storytelling is the association of context to insight. What we often see in our customer stories prior to them working with Toucan is that, well, they found that critical insight. Sometimes they found a critical insight that they want to communicate. And sometimes they already have those KPIs that they know matter to their business. It matters to their department. But they're still having that issue of, well, communicating this graphic. A dashboard is still to this day not that easy to read. The dashboards that we're all familiar with are often filled with different KPIs that may or may not follow each other. There's not always context. And it's very difficult to understand what is the trend that we're looking for. What is the message that the analyst is trying to communicate to us as business users in order to act? Ultimately, Joe, the question is, what purpose does BI serve if it's not to inform a business person for them to take a smart decision afterwards? So data storytelling very much is about adding the context to graphics in order to turn it into a digestible information in order for people to act upon it. All right. And one thing that you mentioned, Joe, or a nuance that is important to mention, is at what point does data storytelling come in? As I mentioned it, in most of our use cases, our customers already know what KPIs are important. Therefore, it's not about exploring that information. It's about communicating. It's about finding a way to communicate that information. And this is where data storytelling comes in. And that is a sort of semi-permanent data storytelling report because, well, those 10 KPIs, a marketing department is always going to look at pretty much the same KPIs all the time. A C-suite is going to look at the same KPIs pretty much all the time. But sometimes data storytelling is about communicating a one-off finding that needs to be communicated extremely urgently right after an analyst has done a very in-depth analysis. And that is a data storytelling report that is going to serve its purpose one time and then be kind of thrown away. So it's very important to understand that data storytelling doesn't necessarily come only when there's one kind of insight that has been found after analysis. Sometimes data storytelling can be done from an Excel spreadsheet because the KPIs that are present in that Excel spreadsheet or any kind of data source are important to communicate to that audience.
And I think, JP, you kind of hit the nail on the head there. The sort of key piece that differentiates data storytelling from data analysis is thinking about how we communicate and what we're communicating, adding that context. And so whether it's a particular insight that's from a one-off investigation that was conducted, or whether it's sort of ongoing analysis and monitoring, it's converting the data insight into a narrative. And so we're going to talk more about this as we break down what makes a good data story, but sort of highlighting that difference, and thank you for bringing up exploration versus explanation. So we can think of data analysis as happening on two different fronts. Data exploration is maybe what I'm doing as an individual business analyst or data scientist, digging into the data, finding what's there and what's relevant. This is what happens after that stage, right? So maybe I've identified what's important. Data storytelling is helping me communicate that and explain it to a business user. And so with that, we'll talk about why we need data storytelling, right? Well, one of the big concerns out there for organizations, as many of you know, is data literacy rates continue to be fairly low across businesses. And it's something that's expensive and difficult to raise, right? You could create an initiative to train people throughout your organization from high to low on data skills, help them become data literate, help them do their own data work. But that's really not the most efficient use of time or resources, right? If we can lower the bar for data consumers to be able to digest the insights, which we can do through better communication around those insights, we can avoid the need to sort of make everyone a data professional, right? Allow the data professionals to do what they do well and allow everyone else within the organization to do what they do well. Just use that translation layer of data storytelling to bridge the gap between those different verticals within the organization. The second piece is a matter of the friction you were discussing earlier, JP, right? So within an organization, even if you have high data literacy rates, it doesn't really make sense for everyone to be doing their own data analysis all the time, to be having to kind of comb through the numbers and dashboards and figure out what's important for themselves. It's just not efficient. So if I'm an executive, I have a lot of executive tasks on my plate. I don't need to be doing the tasks of identifying the relevant insights from my data on top of that. Time is a premium for a lot of these folks, especially at the decision maker level. And so if we want decisions to be driven by data, we need to make it really easy for them to understand which data is relevant. Which brings me to my third point. There's too much data, right? We live in a world of big data now. The issue isn't finding the data, not having enough data. We have ways to bring the data in. What more and more organizations are facing is they don't know which data is relevant. They have so much. It's more a matter of paring down, of determining what is really critical and what can actually drive business outcomes. And so data storytelling, from a methodology standpoint, is all about simplification and paring down. It's about making it so what's important stands out from the rest. And so with that, we'll talk about what makes a good data story. So we know from an organizational standpoint why it's important, why we need it, where it falls within the business. It's this bridge between the data side and the business side. It helps us to pare down to what's important and create action from our data to really drive decisions. But how do we do it? Sort of what are those nitty-gritty details that enable us to achieve all of these desirable outcomes? Well, a good data story really consists of two pieces. There's visual design and there's narrative. And so when we talk about a data story, when we talk about putting data in context, when we talk about making it digestible, both of these are really relevant. And so we're going to talk about the first piece, visual design, and then we'll talk about narrative. On the visual design side, this is going to be a theme throughout, but simplification is really important. So a lot has been written in this space. Edward Tufte is sort of the premier example of someone who really thought deeply about visual design for data presentation. Since then, lots of other folks have come out. And I've listed a few sort of rules of thumb here, but JP, I know this is an area that Toucan takes very seriously and has spent a lot of time thinking about the design choices that go into the platform. So I was hoping you could kind of share some of those thoughts, the things that you need to think about as you're designing an effective data visualization.
Sure. So, Joe, I want to just mention one of the points that you mentioned earlier that is very much linked to the importance of good visual design. And that is that time is a premium. Now, when we talk about time in analytics, there are two moments that are important for a dashboard, right? There's a time that it takes to deploy a dashboard. So that's the visual expertise that you need to put in there. That's the design aspect. And then there's the story that you're trying to tell behind it. So that's the deployment part. But then there's the adoption part. So do people understand the message? Do you need to train people to understand the tool that they're about to use? Do you need to brief your audience in order to take them through the KPIs that you've just built? Now, when we look at the last 10 years, Joe, there is no lack of design best practices workshops, of design books. How do you tell a good story? What color code should you use? What font should you use? And despite all of that knowledge, we're seeing that, well, analysts are still struggling to create dashboards that are easy to use from a design standpoint. And, well, adoption rates are not lying. We're still at 30% despite the billions of dollars that have been invested. So what does that mean? This means that within the analytics world, there is or there has been a bad product to market fit. So what we've done at Toucan is that we've taken a very strong decision. We are a very opinionated solution. And when I talk about opinionated, about the fact that we're opinionated, it means that we've decided to take some of the subjectivity of design, which means that it's related to someone's skill, and we've made it an objectively great design by embedding those design best practices in the product. And that is a huge differentiator from a product standpoint within the analytics world.
JP,
so what do I mean by
think
that?
What might be helpful here is if we take a look at some of those concrete decisions, right? So if we think about sort of what are all of these decisions that designers were having to make on their own before, there are so many things to think about when we do visual design. So what are some of those pieces? So I've listed some here. And I know you had a particular example you wanted us to look at. So we can go to that, or if you want to add some more kind of comment on any of the pieces here on this slide. But in general, these are things like making it visually simplistic, right? Highlighting the data, not distracting the viewer, right? So we talk sometimes about business intelligence tools give more and more choices to data analysts, typically, right?
Yeah.
Which allows them to build things that are really beautiful, but aren't necessarily clear. And
Exactly.
so if we think about sticking with simple shapes, right? So rectangles, circles, things that aren't going to distract the viewer, right? One of the things that comes up a lot is we see, someone thought it would be clever to do a fill on a shape. But the human eye isn't really good at judging proportions on complex images. And so it starts to slow down, right? Your brain is processing and thinking longer when there's the added complexity. So it's understanding where you can take that complexity away, whether it's in terms of colors or patterns or shapes. But there's lots of little things to think about.
Exactly. So there are a lot of things to think about, Joe. And what we've done is we've inserted guidance in the product. And not only guidance, but we've also designed best practices so that an analyst doesn't have to think of all of these very complex choices, which down the line show that there is no real impact. The font that you choose, for example, is not going to have a real impact. I mean, it might have a real impact, but not necessarily. The kind of colors that you choose, well, if we're able to understand what is the best color that is going to make greatest impact, if you understand that, we're going to build it in the product. So you can move to the other slide, and I'll give you an example of how a font might affect how easy or how clear a deliverable might be, or graphic might be, or a story might be. If you look at this example, if you look at the numbers, so $323 million, $91 million, you see that the numbers are not really aligned. What does that mean? It means that you're not able to easily determine the order of magnitude of the number. So for example, $78.5 million is slightly bigger than $91.6 million. And that is difficult on the eye. Now, what I'm trying to say here, Joe, is that this is a minor detail. But when you add all of these minor details in a deliverable, it turns out to have a huge impact. It turns out to be something that is not clear. So if we move on to the next slide, this is an example of one of the built-in design choices that are in Toucan. We don't give the liberty for an analyst to choose a font. We have chosen the best font that is going to ensure clarity all the way. The font on the left side is an example of a font, but the font on the right side is a font that is typically used by coders in coding software. And the difference in both of these fonts is that, well, on the right one, numbers are always aligned. Now, if you move on to the next slide, you see that when we choose the latter font, the numbers are automatically are aligned, which means that it's much easier for the eye to understand the order of magnitude of the number and therefore understand the message. Now, as I mentioned, this is a tiny detail, but when you add minor details that are going to promote the adoption or to ease the adoption of the deliverable, that leads to huge impact. And this is exactly what we've seen with our customers. Moving on to a product that is much more guided in terms of how you deliver, much more guided in the design sense. The numbers speak for themselves because adoption rates are much bigger and business impact, which is what matters, is much higher. So that's a small example that I think is very interesting to showcase.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing that with us. I think that just goes to show sort of the level of granularity of some of these decisions where, it seems like something that wouldn't make a big difference, and it doesn't, but we're talking fractions of a second, a little bit more brain effort. But if you're looking at raising adoption rates across a large enterprise, that adds up, right?
Yeah.
And so over time, if it's just a little bit easier to use, that's saving hours collectively across an entire organization.
Exactly.
And so here I'm going to transition a little bit into the next piece of data storytelling. So we've got visual design, right? When we think about what makes a good graphic, what allows our brain to sort of interpret quickly, decisions around colors, shapes, fonts, spacing, all of these little bits and pieces that come out of the graphic design world, come out of psychology, the way our eyes and brains interpret information and what's intuitive for the human mind. The other piece is narrative. And so this is where we talk about communicating an insight, making it really easy to understand what the takeaway is. And so when I say data story, maybe what jumps into mind is that classic story arc you probably learned in elementary or middle school, right? We've got exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, resolution. And actually, a data story is a little different than that. There is no rising action in a data story. A data story is all about explaining what happened. So we start with exposition, right? We lay that ground level. So in the exposition of a traditional story, we meet the main characters. We learn the primary locations in which our story is going to take place. We get that context for the story. And that's more or less the same, right? Context is a really critical piece of the data story. We need to know what are the KPIs we're looking at? What is the context in which this data was collected, understanding what it is we're looking at before we can understand what it is that happened. The next piece is diagnosis. And so this is where it starts to differ from a traditional story. In a traditional story, some event occurs, right? There's some tension that's created within the narrative that causes the characters to change. Well, in a data story, we're looking at something that's already happened. There's not an action taking place in the middle of our data story. We're looking back, trying to figure out what happened. And so this is the section I call the diagnosis, where we dig past the context and say, okay, this is what we're looking at. What is it that occurred? And so once we've done that, we move into what is really, in my mind, the most critical part of a data story, and that's the recommendation. This is where, okay, we set up the context, we said what happened, and now we're going to say what you should do with that. We're going to project into the future. And so this is a call to action statement where the data storyteller says, okay, X happened, so do Y. And that's kind of in the nutshell, the simplest data story. X happened, so do Y. And now this is designed to sort of lower the burden on the data consumer. It's not that we want data analysts to be making decisions for all of our businesses. What we want is for business leaders to be able to make data-driven decisions. So they don't have to accept the recommendation. This may be a jumping off point to start a longer conversation that reveals that more analysis is needed, or more data is needed, or different data is needed. But what it is it gives a jumping off point for that conversation to start. And in many cases, it may well be a fairly straightforward explanation. But the key is this is the part that links the data to the decision, right? So we have the data is explained, the event that occurred, the insight is communicated, and then what you're supposed to do with that insight is added on, is communicated as well. So it's not just about, okay, this is what happened with the data, is linking that data to action. So that's going to come up again and again. This is all about data connecting to action. And so you can see here at the bottom, I've put that explanation, not exploration quote again. This is something to really keep in mind. The whole idea of a data story is to explain the data, not to explore the data. There's lots of other ways to explore data. A data story is explanation, is communication, is connecting data to action. And so we've hopefully given you a fair amount to think about in terms of all the pieces that go into a data story. And with any luck, you have a good sense of what makes up a data story. But as you may have gathered, making a data story requires a lot of decision making. It is, in and of itself, a skill set. And a lot of data analysts and data scientists don't have the skill set for that, right? These are data professionals. They're highly technical. They're really skilled in the tools they use in numeracy and statistics. They're not necessarily skilled in things like graphic design or storytelling, nor should they be, nor should they need to be. And so what we've really seen in the last couple of years that I think is a really interesting development in the business intelligence space more broadly is this idea of industrializing data storytelling, right? So JP was talking about this a little bit in the context of the visual design piece earlier. And so looking at sort of concrete decisions that can be taken out of the hands of data storytellers or data analysts or data scientists, if you will, right? How do we enable folks who don't have the intuition, don't have those skill sets to make great data stories? Well, we go ahead and incorporate best practices directly into platforms. And so this is where we see the emergence of built-in design decisions. So in the visual design standpoint, it's incorporating best practices. There's no reason to arbitrarily force an analyst to pick colors if we already know what colors are most effective. Similarly, we can automate these decisions around shapes, around the kinds of charts that are effective for communication. And so having those built in is sort of one of these trends that we're starting to see. And Toucan is an excellent example of that. Another piece is the integrated framework. And so this is where we think about that narrative. So if there's really three key pieces to the data story, we need a platform that sort of guides the process of telling a data story and allows the data storyteller, the data analyst, scientist, whoever the person creating the story is, to walk down that path, right? Okay, where am I doing my exposition? Where am I doing my diagnosis? Where am I communicating that call to action? And the last piece here starts to segue into the next part of our presentation, looking more at the infrastructure. But it's how do we distribute data stories? So in the past, we've had data stories, but they typically happen in PowerPoint, right? So someone's made a data visualization. They've spent a lot of time working on it, thinking about how to visualize, using their best practices, and then they've copied and pasted that into a slideshow. and they're throwing it up in a boardroom in front of business decision makers, and they're adding the story as an oral presentation. They're walking through the slides, they're explaining the context, they're diagnosing what happened, and maybe they're giving a recommendation, but that's all happening in an enclosed space. It's not repeatable, it's not reusable, and it stays in a confined part of the business. If we can industrialize data storytelling, it's not just about making data storytelling easier and faster, it's also about making sure that the data stories go further and have more of an impact on the broader business, making sure everyone has access to the data story, and really liberating it from the boardroom. And so one of the ways we do this parallels one of the other big trends in the space right now, which is this turn toward cloud-first business intelligence. And so you all have all heard this story before, I'm sure, but cloud investments are accelerating, right? Especially in the last year with COVID, we've seen companies that were cloud hesitant move onto the cloud. People are moving their data in droves onto sources like Snowflake, onto AWS, turning to SaaS products. Cloud is clearly at this point the wave of the future. And so as companies are migrating their data, that means their BI has to migrate as well. And migrating reports is difficult. When you're moving data sources, reports start to break, and older tools aren't necessarily designed with the cloud in mind. Often you can jerry-rig a solution, but it's not sort of the cloud-first design that you need when you're moving to a cloud-first data strategy. And all of this sort of gets to the point that's come up a few times now, which is speed. So one of the things that really determines the value of a BI project is speed. In a business environment, you need to make a decision, and you need to make it on a business timeline, not an IT timeline, right? I can't spend months waiting to get an answer. The opportunity will have passed. My ability to use that data will have passed. And as a result, the value of that data will have decreased because I wasn't able to use it to take advantage of the opportunity that existed at that time. And so we're increasing speed by increasing how quickly the data is communicated by using data stories, but we're also increasing the speed by creating an environment that works with our data sources, works with the cloud in a frictionless way from a technology standpoint. And so, of course, one of the key pieces here is this ability to connect to next-gen data sources, things like Snowflake. Native integration with cloud data is really important. If your data is in the cloud, you need to be able to get to it quickly, smoothly, and without a lot of hassle, right? I don't want to have to pull it out of the cloud and bring it back into my tool. The back and forth slows it down. It throws more sand in the gears of the system and makes it harder for me to recoup the value from my data. And all of this sort of leads to one other piece, which is the ability to access data. So we were talking about getting data stories out of the boardroom. And one of the ways we do this is with mobile-first, web-based distribution. This is something that's enabled by the cloud, enabled by new tools that understand where data stories are most important, where business intelligence can have the greatest impact, and realizing that isn't necessarily in a board meeting. It might be, but a lot of times the data story is most potent in the hands of the frontline worker, right? So if I am on location somewhere, one of the examples that came up in my conversations for the report that I just wrote was at a construction company. They were working on scheduling. Scheduling obviously is a big deal in the construction industry. And when you're on site, you're going to have access to a PowerPoint and a business analyst who's going to be able to go through and explain these insights that they have discovered. What you need is something that you can look at on your phone and immediately understand what the takeaway is. And so that's a data story, but it's not just a data story. It's a data story that's technologically enabled for mobile, right? That I'm able to get not just on my desktop computer, but actually in the field where I am in the moment. And that's something we see across a wide variety of industries. It's not just construction. It's the data story that's consumed by the person working in the fast food restaurant about consumer habits and what to sort of prepare for and when to expect customer numbers to increase throughout the day to have more staff on hand if you're a fast food manager. And so these are where we see the real value of data stories, because these aren't folks that are highly technical, right? They're not necessarily data literate, but they really benefit from the insights that data provides. And so if we can translate via data storytelling the data into that insight and then deliver that insight into their hands wherever they are when they need it, we start to really see the value of our data. And so we do this when we have platforms that allow us to access the data stories from anywhere. The web-based side is one of the ways we do this. And so when we talk about democratized data, when we talk about cloud first, One of the things the cloud lets us do is access that data from anywhere. We have shared repositories of data stories. We can access those from anywhere. It's not just data, right? I want to be able to access the insights. And so when we talk about democratizing data, what I mean here is when I create a data story, I'm putting it in a place where people from across my organization are able to view it. It's not staying as a file on my desktop that I'm emailing around. It's put in a central location where anyone can access it. And the final piece of this is speed and scalability, right? This is, the eternal benefit of the cloud, of SaaS products: faster deployment, flexible infrastructure, and outsourced maintenance. When we talk about faster deployment, it's things like a managed solution. BI tools are increasingly sort of turning and trying to offer these sorts of things, but newer tools are able to do that immediately because they're designed with that in mind. And so if I'm not spending a lot of time trying to manage my infrastructure, trying to keep up with updates, make sure that things aren't going to break my reports, if all of that is handled for me, that allows me to spend my time and resources on actually deriving value from my data. And because speed is so critical in all of this, the deployment piece is really non-trivial here. When we talk about the ability to derive value from BI, it's based around how quickly we're able to do it. And having a cloud-based system helps us do it much, much faster. JP, I'll let you chime in on any of those points, and then we'll go ahead and open up for questions here in the last 15 minutes or so.
Sure, Joe. So, one of the insights that really surprised us a couple of quarters ago was that when we analyzed all of the the leads that we were having, the opportunities that we were seeing, we saw that 1 in 3 opportunities that we were having were from customers who had just moved to Snowflake. And the issue that they were seeing is that they were having trouble leveraging their existing BI tool with Snowflake. So the situation here, Joe, is that you have a BI manager who invested a huge amount of money into a cloud data provider with data that is, ready to be distributed. But the issue is, there are 2 issues that we're facing. From a technical standpoint, there was a migration that they needed to take care of, and going from an on-prem solution to a cloud solution, especially when you're already working with a legacy tool, is extremely complex. And then you've got the distribution issue, which is what I mentioned initially, which is, how do you deliver information that is clear enough in record time for an audience of business people without training them? And so what this means, Joe, is that ultimately, whether you're in the cloud or you still have your data hosted in your own servers, the issue is still the same, which is it's a distribution issue, whether you're in the cloud or on-prem. If you're going to design dashboards just like you'd like them to be designed, that is going to lead to a lot of complexity, hence the industrialization of data storytelling, right? So the 1 in 3 opportunities was a really mind-boggling number, because we said, there is a real problem happening here. And it's something that we've seen, several years in advance, because we are opted to become a cloud solution and to focus on the distribution aspect. So that was what we're seeing in the market right now is a trend that is becoming reality. It's a bet that we did several years ago, saying, people are going to move to the cloud and they're going to have a distribution issue. So that is a number that I wanted to share, because that's direct from the market number that is confirming some very strong hypotheses that we had on the market.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we've got our first questions coming in now. And so please, if you have more questions, go ahead and put them up, and we'll sort of answer them as we go along. We'll try to get to everyone. If we run out of time, we can try to follow up on some of those if you have a pressing question. But we'll get to as many as we can. So our first question is, does data storytelling techniques used with qualitative data, that is normally highly unstructured, differ from the techniques used with quantitative data? And so this is a great question. First off, I think this really gets to something that's very important about data storytelling, and understanding that data storytelling is a methodology, right? And so a lot of the premises that we've brought up today are, yes, absolutely applicable no matter what kind of data you're using. So let me roll back to our slide looking at data stories. When we talk about a data story, this arc, right? The exposition, the diagnosis, the recommendation, it doesn't matter what kind of data you're using here. You can actually use this framework for things that aren't even data-based, but it's particularly potent when we're doing a data story, because we need the context, we need the takeaway, and we need the call to action. And so whether I'm, analyzing data that's in a table, or I am looking at the results of complicated ML model, or even dealing with really qualitative data in the form of images or sound bites or things like that, I can still give the context around the data, right? Where does this come from? What does it represent? If it's numerical data, what are the units? So these are all sort of elements that give us that wrapper on the data to say, this is where it's coming from, this is what it is and why it's relevant. Then the diagnosis piece. This is true regardless. Again, this is sort of what's important in my data. I've got it, whether it's numbers, whether it's unstructured data. Why do I care, right? What is the thing that either occurred or the thing that I need to know about this data? And that third piece is true across qualitative or quantitative data as well, which is, okay, I know what happened, what do I do with that? And so absolutely, any of the things that we've talked about in terms of what makes a good data story are consistent regardless of the kind of data that we're dealing with. The visualization pieces, that may vary, right? So, it may not be data that you can visualize. A lot of times it is, which is why we spent time talking about sort of what makes for good data visualization. 90% of the time, I would say, right? Like if we're looking at the kinds of data that are being used in BI workflows, a lot of that is sort of our traditional structured data sources, right? We're pulling in information that we were already using in dashboards and reports, and we're repackaging it into data stories that are easier to consume. But absolutely, you can use this for things that aren't structured data, and the methodology holds true and continues to deliver value. Let's see, I think we've got some more questions here. To what extent is the current market of BI and analytics platforms support automated data storytelling for different types of analytics, i.e. descriptive, diagnostic, predictive, prescriptive analytics? This is a great question. And so this sort of speaks to the maturity of the market right now. And so what we're doing here is sort of analyzing emerging trends. Right now, this is sort of something new that we're seeing in the market that hasn't really been there before. People are beginning to recognize the importance of automated data storytelling, of this industrialized data storytelling. But there still aren't many folks doing it. And that's sort of why we wanted to bring it to you today and sort of demonstrate why this is important, why this is going to have such an impact in the way we do business intelligence. Because it's still early days for a lot of that. Certainly Toucan is doing that. There are a couple of other folks out there beginning to play around with how do we automate this process, but it's still very, very manual for the most part. If you're using your traditional legacy BI tools, you're doing all of this by hand. All of those decisions are still resting on the business analyst, on the data analyst, on the data scientist to be able to tell a good data story. And so that's the real takeaway from the report that we've done and really from this presentation, right? So we talked about data storytelling. Data storytelling by itself isn't new. What's new is the ability to automate that. JP, I don't know if you want to chime in on either of those questions. We've got a few more we can get to after that.
Yeah, sure. So for the second question, Joe, what we see is we have different kinds of vendors. You have the mainstream vendors who have been speaking about data storytelling and marketing storytelling for a few years now. But when you analyze the product, it turns out to be a very manual, kind of like similar to a built-in PowerPoint tool in the BI product. So that's not automated. This is very much a manual operation. But then you have the newer vendors who are focusing solely on storytelling as if it was a completely new category in business intelligence rather than a simple capability. But they focus on either the narrative aspect of a data story. So you feed them a data set and they try to make a story or a narrative based on that. Or you have vendors that are going to focus on the design aspect. So I, as an analyst, as a data storyteller, know what kind of story I want to tell because I know my audience and nobody knows it better than me. But I need a platform to insert those insights in a way that is going to make that story scalable. What does scalable mean? It means that it's deployable on any mobile device. It's accessible to anyone without having to train them because the deliverable is always of extremely high quality and extremely clear because of, for example, the design best practices. So that's how the design aspect or the quality of design is automated versus the narrative part, which can be automated as well. So to answer the question is, today you have new vendors who are focusing on the automation of data storytelling and who are betting on data storytelling as a sort of a semi-new category of analytics. But then the mainstream vendors are just inserting data storytelling because it's the new hot word in the market, but their data storytelling capability is not that powerful.
All right, so we got another question coming in. Why would a BI manager choose yet another BI tool simply because they're moving to the cloud? And so this is a good question, and I apologize if this is somewhat because of the way we presented today these two things in parallel. These are certainly parallel trends, right? They're things that we're seeing happening in the space right now, but they're sort of the data storytelling piece and the cloud piece, while linked, aren't one and the same. So why would you choose a BI tool simply because you're moving cloud? Well, the cloud piece really speaks, I think, for itself when we talk about its cloud first design, right? A lot of the tools that exist today existed before the cloud had reached the mainstream point where it is now. And so when you talk about sort of jerry-rigging some of these platforms, you can make it work, right? But there's a difference in the ease and the ability to use it. And so this is really a question of less about data storytelling, I think, and more just sort of about what is the value in having cloud-based BI with a cloud-based data set. And the answer there is it's really all about reducing that friction. So if you're trying to do all these workarounds and patches, that's adding layers of work on top of your BI that aren't immediately relevant to getting insights out of your data, right? The more time and money you're spending trying to make the software work, trying to make the technical solution work, the less time you're able to spend on really deriving value from the data. And as we've seen sort of this enormous growth in cloud data storage, having tools that are designed from day one, are native to the cloud or cloud first in their architecture, is really going to let you tap into those with a lot less friction.
If we look at this from a problem standpoint, right? So when we talk to our customers to understand what are their needs, when I talk to a BI manager who just invested in the cloud, he just looks at me and says, you know what, JP, we've invested so much money, but I'm not able to prove the value of that investment. It goes back to what I said before, which is what is the point of investing in the cloud if you're not able to leverage that information as quickly as possible and with as much ease as possible? Yeah, that's the question. And then he tells me, but just having to invest again in the migration in the tools to go from on-prem solution to a cloud solution is already technically very difficult. And that's why opting for a BI tool that is technically aligned with a cloud data provider is already a huge gain of time. That's the first thing. And the second thing is, well, when we talk about deployment, and it goes back to what I said before, building a dashboard does take a bit of time. When you have different analysts who understand the design of quality or interpret the design quality of deliverable differently, well, that's going to take some time because you have to align everyone, you have to build in those design best practices, teach them to these individuals, and then deliver that report to the business individuals without any insurance that they're going to understand what message you're trying to communicate. So that's from a product positioning standpoint. So when you've invested in a cloud data provider, in a cloud infrastructure, what you want to do as a BI manager is prove the value of the investment that you've made by working with a solution that is very much adapted to that new modern infrastructure. It's very difficult to adapt an older BI tool or one that is not positioned for these kinds of use cases to those kinds of infrastructure in record time and with record ease. So that's why you might move into a new generation of BI platform that is focused on storytelling.
Right. I think the key takeaway there from both of our answers is it's all about sort of reducing friction. Things that are technically aligned are going to work in much greater fluidity. All right, so our next question is, what if I'm not yet in the cloud? Does that mean data storytelling is too early for me? And again, I think this gets to sort of, we were presenting these in parallel. And I do want to reiterate, there's a lot of value to sort of adopting these two things in the same way, especially as we talk about distributing data stories. That's something that can really be facilitated by having a cloud-based solution for that and making it accessible from anywhere. And those things that we were talking about in terms of mobile first, web-based, democratized data stories that are accessible to anyone in the business wherever they are. But that said, no, absolutely not. So if you're not in the cloud yet, you can totally still do data storytelling. Data storytelling, technically, you don't even need a computer to do it, right? A data story could be something that you do on a whiteboard. It could be entirely analog. It really is at its core a methodology. It's the process we talked about of setting up context for data, whether it's qualitative, quantitative, any sort of information, diagnosing what happened in the data, and then giving a recommendation, giving a prescription, giving the takeaway, the call to action. And that can be done anywhere and anything. There's just different ways to sort of make it go further. And that's where the cloud piece comes in, really, is making the data story go further. If I do it on a chalkboard, only people in the room see the data story or are able to act on it. If I do it in a cloud-based software solution, all of a sudden I can distribute the data story much more broadly. But the value of data storytelling can happen even if it's not automated. It's just you get sort of those synergies between the two that start to help you derive even more value once you've already started telling data stories.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Ultimately, if we look at it from a very high point of view, what is the point of a vendor who just arrived on the scene? It is to remove friction, as you said. It is to go even faster than before, is to remove maintenance, is to make sure that you deploy something fast and it's adopted fast. Today, we talk to customers who are Fortune 500 businesses, and it's very difficult to move such a big mammoth, such a big ship from, well, legacy systems to very modern platforms. So what does that mean? It means that there's still a lot of things happening on premises. Now, data storytelling is about communication. And the advantage of working with modern platforms is that they're aware of the existing infrastructure that a client might have, rather than them trying to adapt to a new kind of infrastructure that they were not prepared for. What does that mean? It means that new vendors are willing to do on-prem and on the cloud most of the time. So technically speaking, there's not much difference in their abilities to connect with an existing infrastructure. Now, when it comes back to storytelling, some of our clients have an Excel spreadsheet and that's all they have. The cloud is not even a subject of conversation. There, when you work with customers who might not be very much, who might be late to the game of big data, some of them are still on Excel. They don't even have a data source. But the problem that they're facing is, how can I turn this Excel spreadsheet or that huge data set in a random data source into something that looks good, that is clear? That's the main point, something that is clear, so that I, as a business analyst or a data analyst, can deploy it extremely fast without needing to adapt it to the different mobile environments or without needing to be a design expert. And make sure that my business users are going to understand it very quickly without me needing to train them. So the answer is yes, you can do storytelling on-prem. Why? Because data storytelling vendors who are specialized in that discipline understand the current infrastructure that the client might have had. So technically speaking, there's nothing stopping you. And because they understand the challenges that you're facing as a customer trying to distribute information, to communicate information, rather than explore information. And therefore, the product market fit is much stronger than the data exploration tool, where you might be basically left alone, designing your own dashboard with whatever knowledge you might have. You might be an expert and deliver great things, but you might not be an expert, and this is the majority of the cases, and might struggle or be overwhelmed with creating something that is going to last and that is going to be adapted and that is going to deliver value. So I hope my answer is clear.
All right, and I think our next question maybe gets to something you were talking about a little bit earlier in one of your answers, JP, but can you further explain the difference between Toucan's data storytelling and that of Tableau? And so this is a good question. We've talked about data storytelling a lot, and can you do data storytelling with the tools you already have if you're using a Tableau or a Power BI, things like that? And if so, sort of what's the difference between that and some of these newer platforms that we mentioned that are emerging and looking at data storytelling first as an approach? Because certainly, anyone in the BI space right now is talking about data storytelling, realizing the value of it. And I think one of the key pieces here is when we talk about that industrialization part, right? You can do a data story in any platform. You can do it without software at all, as I mentioned earlier. It's really a matter of difficulty and where the burden of design is, right? So where does the data storytelling skill set fall? Is it on the business user, on the data person who's creating a data story, or is that burden placed on the designers of the platform? And so when we look at some of the options that are out there, it's not that you can't do data storytelling in Tableau. Absolutely you can. You can tell wonderful stories in it, but it's thinking about sort of the automation of different aspects. So Tableau's data storytelling feature, for those of you who aren't familiar with the particular question that was asked, looks something like a PowerPoint, right? So it allows you to proceed through your data visualizations. You can add context. You can bring in a lot of those elements of data storytelling. It's just that those elements aren't necessarily automated. So that's when we see sort of the ground up approach of newer BI tools. They're focused on how do you automate some of those things. JP, I think you mentioned some of these things earlier, but maybe you can address them again.
Yeah, I think this question is extremely fair, because what we notice as a data storytelling platform or experts, I should say, is that data storytelling is a word that's been marketed for years now. And what we're seeing is that you have vendors defining data storytelling in different ways. And that's because they have their own interpretation. And so do we, which hence the industrialized storytelling, which is something that we very much promote. I mean, you said it, Joe. It's about how do you take off as much weight as possible in terms of complexity from a data analyst. Today, to give you an example, and this is something that I would not share normally, but I was talking to a sales director in a vehicle financing company, and he was telling me, you know, JP, I'm hiring sales agents for their reporting skills. I'm not hiring them for their ability to sell. And that means business that is being lost down the line. So what does that mean? It means that reporting is still very much a manual task. And it doesn't just apply to salespeople, it applies to data analysts very much as well. Do you prefer to hire a data analyst who is going to understand how to tell a great story and how to dig into data, to explore data and invest your money in that skill? Or would you rather invest your skill in someone who is going to do great design? Great design, as I mentioned, is an extremely important feature of a report. But if you can automate that, you might as well invest in a resource that is going to deliver key insights and deliver clear messages in the best possible way without needing to worry about the design aspect. So we try to automate as much as possible the parts of a data story in order to focus on the most valuable parts that a data analyst or business analyst can invest in, which is communicate information or create a good narrative. So the main difference between Tableau and Toucan is that Tableau's approach to data storytelling is very much the same as Tableau's approach to exploring information, which is you start with a blank sheet. It's a white paper, and then you can do whatever you want. The only difference is that it will look like a PowerPoint presentation. That's what it is. Contrary to Toucan, which for those of you who are familiar with Wix.com or Squarespace.com, which are these B2B websites that allow you to create websites without any code or without needing to be a designer, Toucan is exactly the same thing, but for data and analytics, which means that you have a built-in interface, you have built-in design best practices, and the only thing that you need to worry about is what KPI should I put in first in order for the story to make sense. But you have guidance throughout the interface in order to accelerate time to deployment, to simplify the delivery of a report, and maximize adoption and therefore business impact because things are built in. And that is what I meant by an opinionated solution, because we have analyzed and we know what are the design best practices that work best. For example, you're not going to see a pie chart. Now, I know that the audience is very much a data audience, but we don't have pie charts in Toucan, even though it's the most common graphic. Why? Because a pie chart does not communicate a clear message. And our analysis shows that. So that's just one example of how we built in guidance and best practices in a tool rather than provide absolutely no guidance when it comes to communicating data to wide audiences.
All right, great. And we're just about at time there. So I think that'll cover all the questions we can get to today. Thank you again to all of you who joined us, either live today or who are viewing this as a recording in the near future. Hopefully you were able to take away something helpful to you and your organization today. Good luck. Take care. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.